fifth in our series, Frontiers in Educational Technology. And I will now hand over to Owen for introductions. And yeah, it'd be about half an hour or so, and then sort of 20 minutes, 25 minutes for questions. Okay, sorry, Owen, over to you for introductions. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thanks for joining, and Kristen, thanks for making the time to speak to us today. I know it's a long day for you, so we appreciate it. For those of you who don't know, Kristen DiCerbo, his PhD, is the Chief Learning Officer at Khan Academy. In this role, she's responsible for driving and communicating the instructional and pedagogical strategy for Khan Academy's learning programs, the content, and the product in order to improve student and teacher engagement and their learning outcomes. A key part of her role is ensuring pedagogical coherence across all the different offerings and ensuring that the product is research informed in its design, its content, and its programs. Prior to Khan Academy, Kristen was the Vice President of Learning Research and Design at Pearson. And throughout her career, she has focused on conducting and embedding learning science research into digital learning experiences. She's also worked with Cisco Networking Academy and served as a school psychologist in the Arizona School District. She has a BA in psychology and sociology from Hamilton College, a master's in education and PhD in education psychology from Arizona State University. Also a great person to work with, and so I'm just really glad you guys get to learn a little bit more about what you're up to at Khan Academy, and I'll leave it to you, Kristen.
Great, thanks for the invitation, Owen, and I'm excited to talk to all of you. I do have some slides and a talk to give, but want to make sure we have plenty of time too for questions at the end. So I look forward to some conversation. As Owen said, my background is in educational psychology, and that is the piece where I come from. But since then, I've also really been focusing on digital learning environments and moved kind of from calling myself an educational psychologist to a learning scientist, which really I think when I think about learning science, it's really the intersection of educational psychology and human-computer interactions and thinking about cognitive psychology and a number of different disciplines that come together to think about really both understanding how people learn, but also creating and building experiences that then build on those learnings and where they are. And then along the way, as part of my PhD, I also really got a lot of background and interest in assessment and how we understand what people know and can do. And that has led to deep dives into what we would call data science. And so I see a lot of what I do as bringing learning science and data science together for learning impact. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. Khan Academy is pretty well known, but wanted to give you just a little bit of summary for those who may not be familiar, or to give you a little taste. Maybe you're familiar, you've gone on and watched a couple math videos to get through something for homework, or worked with younger siblings or cousins or your kids on it, but wanted to give you kind of the bigger picture. So we are a nonprofit educational organization. Our mission is to provide a free world-class education to anyone, anywhere. And I will tell you that of all the places I've worked, the focus on this mission at Khan Academy is pretty unique. That it is the case that everyone at Khan Academy can kind of say these words, they roll off their tongue, and it's what we are all about. In terms of our reach, we get to about we have more than 100 million registered users in 190 countries. We have about 20 million learners visit the site every month. We have 240,000 teachers around the world use Khan Academy in the last year. And overall, we are in 40 plus languages. Some of those languages we've got, for instance, videos translated, but not all the practice, or some of the practice. So we say 40 plus, it's probably around 50 at this point. So that's a little bit about our reach. This is a screenshot from yesterday of the top courses, but even as you see in here, you can say click on See All Math or See All Science. There's actually a number of additional courses buried underneath here, but to give you a sense, we've got a lot of math and science, some arts and humanities, economics, And then we've also got a life skills section with social and emotional learning from our Khan kids that I'll talk more about, personal finance, growth mindset, internet safety, and some other areas as well. So pretty broad coverage in terms of the domains that we cover. We do, one of my personal favorite parts is actually our Khan Kids app, which is aimed for kids 2 to 7 and gets us a lot of those early literacy and numeracy skills. And the big pieces here, again, of course, as all Khan Academy, 100% free, no ads, no subscriptions. We are funded primarily through philanthropy and donations for this work. So we want to here close that opportunity gap that exists before kids even get to school for low-income families and their peers. So that's an important piece of the Khan Academy Kids mission. We have been, as an organization, on a bit of a journey. The organization started literally with Sal Khan making videos for his cousin in his closet, and then his other cousins who were, hey, I need some help with math too. Started looking at the videos, and he said, well, it'd be good if it wasn't just me explaining things, you need some practice. And so he started making practice. And all this time he was actually working at an investment bank. And so eventually ended up leaving and starting Khan Academy as an organization. But we really focused on independent learners. So folks were just coming to the Khan Academy site for, hey, I'm working on my homework and I don't get this. How can I get through and move in there? And then we started getting just grassroots demand from teachers who said, hey, I'm using this in my classroom. It would be great if you could give me some summaries of how my kids are doing. If you could, help me make assignments to them. So we started building some classroom tools and tools for teachers. And then more recently, the past 3 years or so, we actually specifically looked at our users and our user base, and to get to the learners who probably need us the most, the learners who aren't motivated on their own to find us, the learners who are in historically under-resourced communities, we understood that we needed to also go into school districts. And so we began to also develop some district offerings, including reporting for districts so they could see what was happening with their schools. We also partnered with NWEA, which is an assessment organization that provides 3 times a year interim assessments, and partnered with them so that they could, in fact, use their scores. They call it their MAP test, their MAP growth test, that we could use their scores to actually drive recommendations on what to practice on and what to learn from at Khan Academy. And so that became another additional offering called MAP Accelerator, where we can accelerate students' growth using Khan Academy and measure that using their MAP growth scores. So that's a little bit of the journey we've been on, from really independent learners to thinking about how we integrate into classrooms. And that's this story will come back again as I start talking about some of the changes that we've gone through in terms of thinking about how our offerings work and how our products work. So what I just gave you are some of what we sometimes call vanity metrics, right? Like those millions of learners and how many people are coming to the site. Ultimately, we want to hold ourselves accountable for, do we help students learn? Do we have evidence that students in working with Khan Academy are actually learning more? And so as we think about that, we don't just want to create the whole product and come to the end and do the evaluations of whether students learn. We want to be thinking about that from the beginning of how we're designing and building the platform and the content and the offerings. So this is where learning science starts to come in. So there are decades of research about what works for learning. And we want to think about how we embed that into the experience that we build. And so there's 3 kind of big pillars that I point to. There's lots of smaller things underneath here, but from learning science, for example, one of the big foundations of how we set up our entire offering is mastery learning. So the idea is when a student's learning a new skill, it's more effective to get to a high level of proficiency on that skill before you then try to build new skills on top of that. Now, unfortunately, that's not really how our school systems work. The teachers have a set amount of content they need to get through in the year. They're going to spend 2 weeks on this topic, 3 weeks on this topic. Whether you've got it or not, we're moving on to the next thing. So it's important for us to be able to offer a tool that teachers can use and students can use to get to that level of proficiency so that they're not ending up with gaps in their learning and those shaky foundations that then we try to build on. There are over 300 studies of mastery learning. There's then meta-analyses that bring those studies together. And there's actually meta-analyses that then attempt to bring together all of the meta-analyses. So this is a well-studied area. And one of the things that often happens as I give talks is people say, hey, what's the cool new thing? What's the bleeding edge? And as someone working in an organization serving all of these millions of learners, I actually don't want our main offerings to be on the bleeding edge. I want to build them on what we know works. And so that's why we think about what do we see across long-term has worked across different disciplines, different types of students, different contexts. And so that's a big piece here when we think about mastery learning. Second, practice with feedback. So one of the important things about learning is when you're learning new skills or new procedures, you want to get fluent in them. You want to be able to apply them quickly and accurately, and without necessarily having to work through the entire basis of that skill to be able to understand it. So the common analogy here is driving a car. So when you first learn to drive a car, you're thinking about, okay, I need to, all right, forgive me, I did learn to drive on a manual transmission, a stick shift, so it was a little more complicated, but got to push in the clutch and let the clutch up and then change gears and then lift my foot up and push the gas down. But after a little bit of practice, that becomes, you don't even think about it, you just do it. So that means your brain doesn't have to focus so much on what you're doing. The same way, if you're doing a long division problem and you need to spend a lot of your cognitive energy on the multiplication facts, you're going to forget the overall process of doing the long division problem and get lost in the process because you spent so much mental energy trying to do the multiplication stages that you need to do to get there. So we want your practice so your multiplication becomes fluent. You're fluent with those facts, and that then you can spend your cognitive energy on remembering all of the steps around long division. And then we get long division to be fluent and we can move on. So the big things here are that practice is important, and we want students to have practice, but it's not just practice, you need feedback too. Is that thing you did correct? And this is a place where technology can really help with alleviating some of the time it used to take. I know when I was in grade school, I would do work on a worksheet. That's good practice. But then I'd turn it in and not get feedback from my teacher for 2-3 days. Or if I was stuck, all I could do was either try to use my textbook or raise my hand and sit in class till the teacher could get to me to ask my question. Whereas technology can provide that immediate support and give you immediate feedback on what you're doing. And so all of that has again been shown to be very helpful and effective in improving learning outcomes. So practice with feedback. And the third thing, of course, is motivation, because learning is hard. I'm sure you're all experiencing that in your programs right now, that learning something new can be really rewarding, but the process itself can be difficult and frustrating. And so we all need help motivating ourselves sometimes. We are not all going to be intrinsically motivated all the time. I know I still sometimes, when I'm thinking like working on writing an article or paper, after I write a couple pages, if I write these couple pages, I'm going to have a little piece of chocolate for a reward. Like, that's okay. But the big things we know about motivation are people are more likely to do things when they expect that they'll be successful at them, which makes sense because who wants to keep doing things when they think they're going to fail at them all the time? And when they value the thing they're doing. I call this expectancy value theory in the motivation literature. And so if you're thinking about learners, then you can think about, okay, how can we help students feel like they can be successful at this. Like if they keep trying, and even if they fail at the beginning, if they keep working on it, that they will be successful, that you can learn anything. And then how do we help them value and see the value of the thing they're doing? Now, sometimes that can be an extrinsic value. So we, we do have points and, things that to reward the activity on our site. It's like the chocolate that I gave myself. But you also can see value in what you're doing sometimes through linking it to their understanding of how things work in the world, through tying it to jobs or hobbies that they have. You can have value because this thing is that you're working on is also valued by your peers, and you have a social component to increasing your learning. So all of those things are levers we can use to increase value. But again, this is taking the learning science and building on that and thinking about how do we build that in. So that's the learning science piece. We also then want to bring data in. And so we ask a bunch of different questions from our data. So some of these I call measurement questions, which are how we, in the education space, we talk a lot about measurement, meaning how do we know what people know, or how do we make inferences about what's going on in someone's brain based on what we see them, the activities and behaviors we see them do. So for instance, we're interested in how can we create a measure of someone's struggle so that we know when to offer different kinds of supports to them. How can we measure how much someone has learned? It turns out that's a really hard problem. How do we improve our items? So when we look at a particular question that we've asked someone, how difficult is this for your average sixth grader? And does it differentiate between students who actually know the content and students who don't? So all of those are questions that we use our data to answer. But then we also, there's always a human component to this. So we look at that struggle metric, and when we design a measure of struggle, you're going to have some trade-offs to make. And you can either, in those trade-offs, you're going to either end up sometimes identifying some learners as struggling when they're actually not, or you can design your metrics so that you sometimes are going to miss learners struggling, but you're sure that those you do identify as struggling are really struggling. So which is better for a teacher in a classroom? Is it better to sometimes label someone as struggling even if they're not? Or is it better to miss some strugglers, but you don't mislabel anybody? That's kind of a tough trade-off, and not something that we would want to just make a decision about as we're thinking about designing these metrics. And so we go and talk to teachers about how do we make those trade-offs? What does this look like, and where do those fit? So there's always a human component, even when something looks like a data problem that we're working on. Similar things I call modeling questions. So these are things where we're looking at what predicts learning. What are the things that we can do on our site to help increase learning? So what learning behaviors on the site lead to better outcomes? Is it someone who's taking all of the hints? Or is it someone who's giving it a problem a try before they take a hint? All kinds of questions about what kinds of things are going to lead to better behavior that then we want to encourage students to use on the site. What features of questions are related to learning, and in what courses and for what age groups? So lots of questions about how we write our questions. What order of activities relate to learning? So that's an example of what I was talking about. Is it better to actually watch the video first and then try a problem? Or is it better to try the problem and then watch the video if you get stuck? All of those kinds of things we're interested in. And again, when we think about humans, people involved in this, teachers use us in different ways in their classrooms. So some assign Khan Academy for homework, some teach their course, say 4 days a week, and have the 5th day of in-class be practice on Khan Academy that's more individualized. Some use us more, like 3 days a week, for practice on grade level work and where that goes, and all combinations in between, which some of those may be more related to outcomes than others. How do we balance teacher autonomy in how they do things with recommending implementation models that we have evidence for? So how much do we push teachers to use us in a certain way versus giving them the autonomy to choose and fit into their classroom and their context that they know certainly better than we do? So lots of questions here that involve the combination of people and understanding what their needs are in context with using data. I do want to answer that question that I started this section with. Are we helping students learn? So we designed to help students learn. We use data along the way to then design and inform the platform. And then we get to the end where we're thinking about, okay, let's do the studies and see if students learn. And so we do see, for example, we have official SAT practice as one of the offerings on Khan Academy. And we see there that if students spend 6 or more hours working on Khan Academy with the recommendations, taking the practice test, it's associated with about a 39-point increase in SAT scores. Similarly, on grades 3 through 8 math, we have a study there from a randomized control study from students actually in El Salvador, where students used Khan Academy in their classrooms 180 minutes a week. Those students gained an additional 0.19 school years of growth compared to students who did not use Khan Academy. And then we also looked at, again, the impact in grades 6 through 9 in a district here in the United States that has a high percentage of students who get free and reduced lunch. That's what FRL stands for here in the United States. It's the government subsidized program for students who need assistance with meals. And here, students who are using Khan Academy, again, made 2 times more progress on their grade level. SBAC is one of the end of year tests that is given across a number of different states in terms of growth. So across these and more studies, we're seeing impact across ethnicity, across income groups, that shows that working on Khan Academy does lead to greater learning outcomes. I'm going to give you a preview of our latest results here. And this looks at students, again, in that MAP growth score. So that was our dependent variable. And so we have students who took that in the fall and then in the spring. This is in the 2020 to 2021 school year. So all sorts of things going on in the pandemic, all kinds of things where we didn't, students were at home for part of the year, students were that. So when we look across all students on the MAP growth test that NWA administers, they saw learning loss, which meant the students were making less progress than the norms for the test expected because of all of the interruptions in schooling. So what we found when we looked at then students who were using Khan Academy, students who didn't use us at all, you can see in that light blue group in each grade level here, had that learning loss. So the pink is the national norm that was established pre-pandemic. And students who didn't use us or used us for less than 15 minutes a week. So those students actually did, we were sure, have access to Khan Academy. They saw that learning loss. They did not increase on average as much as would be expected from the norms. Students who used us 15 to 29 minutes a week saw growth just about, not significantly different from those pandemic norms. So that's not a lot, 15 to 30 minutes a week. Students who used us at least 30 minutes a week not only didn't experience learning loss that on average students experienced that year, they actually made growth against those pre-pandemic norms. So we're pretty excited about these results and see it as we are on the right track. We're doing the right things. And we want to keep thinking about how we then engage students to get them to that 30 minutes a week, engage teachers and districts to get to that piece. But we feel like when students are using us, we're seeing the growth we would like to see. So how do we continue to improve? How do we continue to use what we know is coming up with technology to think about how we can best design that learning experience for learners? And I'm going to tell you a little story here, a little history of Khan Academy. We used to have something called Khan Academy Missions, and it was basically a system that recommended skills to learners based on an algorithm, based on an algorithm that defined what was the next skill for them to learn. And so students could sign up for different missions, but if they signed up for this giant mission called the World of Math, it took 1,400 skills that you see over here on the right. And basically, students could work through them, everything from very basic skills to very complex skills in the world of math. Now, there were a lot smaller missions too that were a lot more bite-sized and students could do, but I think this was one that kind of, sparked students' imaginations in a way, like, hey, if I could get through this whole thing, I would really know math. But so it covered large groups of skills, and students would all be working on their own path at their own pace and where things fit. As we moved into classrooms, we ran into problems in terms of how this just fit into a classroom. So one, teachers start from thinking about assignments. These missions were, you could assign a mission, but it would be 2, 3, 4 months work. And for teachers, that's not how they think about assignments happening. And there was no way to link what they were doing in Khan Academy to the lessons they were learning every day. So the skills that they were learning and how that fit. And there was also not a clear, because it was all using an algorithm behind the scenes. For a learner, if you were practicing on a particular skill, it wasn't clear how to progress toward mastery. So how many more questions do I need to answer? So I'm, say, working on this for, if a teacher did say get to mastery of this, next skill for homework, I don't know if that's going to take me 5 minutes or 40 minutes. And as I'm doing it, I don't know how many more questions I'm going to have to answer. I just have this bar that tells me, what's the probability that I've mastered this? And it's going up and down when I get questions right and wrong. And I don't really know why. And sometimes it goes up a lot, and sometimes it only goes up a little. So it was very opaque for learners to understand what they needed to do to actually get to mastery of something. So it ran into, as we were thinking about fitting into a classroom, a lot of the ways it worked actually didn't align with how teachers and learners wanted to be able to use the site. So we actually pulled away and set up 2 different pieces. One we call course mastery, which then, like missions, you can assign a whole course to a student and they can work on getting, over the course of the year, mastery towards that. So you see up in the upper left here, mastery points. In this course, this is a statistics course, 15,000 mastery points. And as you master each skill, moving up on these purple bands, you gain mastery points. But we also then created a whole assignment structure. So teachers could assign, say, analyzing categorical data, and ask students to complete that, the lessons within that, complete the exercises, complete the videos. So this then creates kind of 2 systems. It's not great. We've still got mastery, but the assignments piece isn't as leaning much towards encouraging mastery. Teachers were assigning completion as opposed to working up to get to proficient or mastered on that particular skill. But the other piece is, in terms of differentiation, it really relies on teachers to make different assignments to students, and students who may not be developmentally ready for it to make choices about what to do next. And so there's always this balance that I'm trying to think about and achieve between what does the system do, what does the teacher do, and what does the student do? And so we were leaning really heavily on the system doing a lot. And now we're leaning pretty heavily on the teacher and the student without as much input from the system. And we're not quite in where I would like to see us in balance yet. So I'm thinking about how can we bring the benefits of machine learning and AI in while maintaining trust, fitting into classrooms, and being fair to learners. So that's what I'm going to touch on for the next few minutes while I wrap and as I come to the end here. So the first big piece that we want to think about and that I think about a lot is trust in our platform. Khan Academy has a very trusted brand, if I use the corporate speak. People trust us. We are free, but they trust us to provide rigorous content that is the right thing and that we're doing. When the system starts giving recommendations that don't make sense or that don't align then to what the students are doing, they start to lose trust. And so in the world of trust in AI systems, people use as a measure of trust the extent to which a person follows the recommendations of the system. And the things that have been shown to influence that are fairness. So, excuse me, I'm going to grab a drink here. So, fairness. If I'm a student, does it seem like I'm doing a lot more than the other student? Does it seem like this is working? And then I'll talk about fairness in terms of outcomes in a couple of slides. Reliability. So is it always doing the same thing with the same inputs, or does it seem like it's doing different things at different times? Privacy, we know, influences trust and shared data and all of those issues. And then usability. So actually, if this experience isn't very easy to use, people don't trust it as much. You might think that those two things aren't naturally tied, but they come together in people's minds, that if this isn't just simple and easy for me to jump into and use, then I don't trust it as much. There are some things that have been shown to increase people's trust that you can do. So when they have systems, they actually design experiments where they give students, expose users to a system that doesn't give them consistent results. And so people, then score how much do you trust the system. And then they give them explanations of the system and why it failed in that particular instance and what that might mean. And so kind of a little bit of a look under the hood of the system, and then have people write their trust in their system. And just getting those explanations of how the system works actually increases people's trust in the system, which is interesting. And in addition, people who believe that they can help the system improve are also more likely to be satisfied with it. So if I'm a teacher and I'm like, that recommendation doesn't make any sense, and I can click a button and say, this doesn't make sense, to help the system understand that that's not a good next recommendation, those teachers are actually more satisfied with the system because they feel like they can help it improve. So there's interesting things there about bringing in the people to how we think about systems. Speaking of systems, I use it a lot to mean the platform or the technology. But the big thing is that our schools are systems. And if you look at systems thinking and the research, this kind of triangle diagram is from Engstrom. And he kind of plays out this idea of you have in different individuals. So in our case, students, there's also teachers and peers, and there's an outcome, but then there's tools and rules and responsibilities that all work together in a system. And right now, we have a set system, and we often try to insert education technology into this system and say it's going to play a role or take on a responsibility that's already taken by, say, a teacher in the system. And teachers may or may not want to give up that role and responsibility. So I was hearing someone present some research about creating what they were calling an engagement detector, so that it was meant to kind of use students' behavior as they were working through an online system to then flag whether the student was engaged or not with the system. And there was a teacher who reacted and said, I already have an engagement detector. It's called my eyes. And so whether it's actually the case that teacher can monitor, all of the students in her classroom at the same time, the thing was she already saw that as her role. And so if we're going to come in and say, hey, the computer can help with this, we need to think about how we're talking to teachers about the fact that they already see themselves in that role. And do they want to have someone else play that role? And just showing the system works and that, hey, it gives me, 0.60 correlation with this and the area under the curve is that, is not going to convince people that should, then therefore that should take that role in their classroom. So I think it's often really important that we think about technology from the perspective of this idea of roles and responsibilities, the existing rules and norms in the classroom, and what that looks like and how we're going to fit in there, instead of just dropping the technology into the classroom and where things sit. So when we think about AI, we want to think about what roles do we want AI to play, and are those things that teachers and students want AI to play? And then finally, we think about fairness. So there's a history, our educational history is that we have unequal outcomes for learners from historically under-resourced groups. And at its foundation, much of AI is using data from our existing systematically biased systems to train new models. So they're existing in our systems are those things that have led to these unequal outcomes. And we really need to be thoughtful about whether we are training our new systems on data that come from our systems that contain bias already, and we're going to train our new systems with that same bias. There's been a lot of work on this. This is, you know, I'm leaning on lots of others and learning from them as this, you know, area is understood. There's been options discussed in the literature. So things like actually going and modifying training data before you train the systems. Things like optimizing the algorithms for fairness. So can we build the algorithm such that it's trying to solve for getting to equal outcomes? Changing output decisions after the fact. So change, if the system recommends X, having the ability to change that recommendation to Y if needed for some group of students and where those are. So for example, we know often that students from historically under-resourced communities actually don't get exposure to grade level content. So they spend so much time trying to fill those gaps that they never get exposed to that grade level content, and that actually puts them further and further behind. So that third option would potentially be changing the you know, recommendation to make sure they're getting, you know, say 25% of their content at grade level or something like that. But all of these have their own issues and introduce their own problems into the system. And so we need to spend more time evaluating the consequences of these recommendations or these ways to alleviate bias, I think, through the lens of how do we think about those disparate outcomes and how do we really start closing those gaps that we see. So there are not good answers here that I've seen, but lots of questions to be explored and understood. So how are we proceeding? I put a little, this is on the bottom right here, a snapshot actually of our video on what the scientific method is as we try to teach people about the scientific method. But essentially, yeah, we are trying to make observations and ask questions and come up with hypotheses and test them about what we're doing. But the general approach is that we want to work certainly with experts in AI and machine learning, and we have some folks, you know, who do research in this area who can help with that. But also, we are working with those who study trust and fairness in these systems, and thinking about how we can create a system that it builds on trust and creates a fair and outcomes for learners. We want to think really carefully about how to balance roles and responsibilities on our platform, the teacher and student. And what that means is we are bringing in teachers and students as part of our product development process. So that process looks like we seek to understand what the problems are that teachers and learners are facing. So that involves lots of qualitative research and understanding. And then we start to identify potential solutions to that problem. Again, bringing in teachers and students, not just to react to those solutions, but to help brainstorm some of those solutions, and then have them work through, you know, what then, okay, if we create this, what does it look like? But in reality, teachers and students don't have the capabilities to design AI systems. That's not their basis. So there's a layer of translation there that needs to happen as we're doing this work between the engineers and the technologists that are designing the system, and then what it will actually do that teachers and students will interact with to try to get that sense. But the third thing is we're actually investigating, minimum viable solutions. So instead of thinking about how do we put the latest and greatest of AI and machine learning into the platform, how can we make sure that we're using just enough to help improve outcomes, just enough to be able to get the benefits of it, but also keep student agency. We ultimately want students to own their own learning, not to blindly follow recommendations from the system. How can we help teachers maintain some control? Because we want teachers to have far more information than our platform's ever going to have about learners. There's only so much data that our platform is going to have. Teachers have a much broader scope of the context, and they should be able to have also the agency to make decisions about what's going on in their classrooms and how that looks. So in keeping that balance, we want to think about not building the whole thing, but how can we think about what can we use to help improve outcomes without overriding those other factors. So that's the work we're doing. Stay tuned. We'll get more. You'll see what's coming next and where we get to. But that's some of how we think about things and the challenges we're currently working to solve. So I'm going to stop there and open it up for questions.
Hey, Kristen, thanks so much for that talk. Really interesting stuff there. Everyone else who's on the line, as normal, just raise your hands if you have any questions. Give you a second to think about that. But maybe just to get us started, Kristen, a lot of interesting stuff there. I think that one thing I wanted your thoughts on was kind of the tension on maybe getting students to do what's quote unquote the optimal solution for their learning versus what they want to do. And it seems like you're kind of trying to optimize for engagement or enjoyment. Like, hey, I like this, I want to keep on doing this. I feel good about doing this. And sometimes that will match up with the best path to mastery, but other times it won't. I know for myself, like I'm a pretty impatient learner, and I like a lot of things I overestimate my own abilities. So if you give my own platform, I'm like, oh yeah, I'm way better, and I'll start way above my head level, and I want to go way too fast, and I don't actually master stuff. And so I think that I was just wondering how you guys think about kind of, trying to solve for engagement or kind of, versus solving for kind of like actually mastering concepts, because those don't always overlap, even though they do sometimes.
You're absolutely right that they do not always overlap. So if it came across that we're optimizing for engagement, that was not the case. We're definitely one of the things we're trying to do is to increase engagement for the things that for the best path for mastery. So given that we think, this may be the best path for mastery, but it involves things you don't kind of intrinsically want to do, how do we increase the level of the enjoyment and just joy that you get from engaging in that stuff that is on the right path? So that can be anything from talking about why this skill that you were going to skip over is actually really important, to giving you, the kind of points. We have this classroom engagement tool called Learnstorm, where students as a class work together to get, increase the number of rings, which represent skills mastered for the whole thing. So there's kind of extrinsic rewards, but basically encouraging engagement of the things that we want you to do, which when I put it like that sounds a little manipulative, but it's actually, in its best form, we're actually showing the joy and the wonder of some of these skills that didn't seem that important or interesting, and or showing how they are necessary to do the building blocks that you need to get to. The other thing that your comment brought up to me is we also want to think about increasing students' metacognitive skills and their ability to self-regulate, which means helping students get a better sense of actually their own learning. We know that people who are novices are pretty bad at estimating what they know and don't know, because they don't know what they don't know. So being able to give students some help in understanding what skills they have mastered and what skills they haven't, and then to see how those skills build on each other to get to where they want to get to. so they can start to improve their own decision making as well.
Awesome, great. If someone else wants to ask a question, jump in or raise your hand. Yeah, now go ahead. Hey, now, do you want to ask a question?
Just waiting to unmute. Ah, okay. I was just waiting to unmute there. Sorry. So I was thinking Kristen, really interesting talk. Thank you. As you know, I should probably open talking to Owen as well on the program. We're very interested in issues around digital inclusion. So it was nice to see that touched upon. And well, there's no more questions around that, but maybe I'll just pick one, which was, I guess you've got so many, learners from around the world. I was just wondering how you identify those who are underserved, because I guess, within the districts and so on and so forth, that's a given, but for the kind of the range of learners you're dealing with, how have you gone about understanding who may be underserved and how you can support them?
So this is another question that overlaps data and data privacy with how we think about learners. So for individual learners coming to our site, we do not collect any demographic data from them. We don't know actually anything about them. It's partly issues of privacy, partly issues of we want our learners to jump right into learning as opposed to filling out 13 screens of information about themselves and where they are. So right now, actually, our understanding of the students from historically under-resourced comes from when we partner with districts. And when we partner with a district, we then have the ability to do data sharing with that district that gives us access to their student information system and lets us get information on race and ethnicity, information on their free and reduced lunch status in the States, and then information on language, like if they're English language learners or not, and where things are. So the risk there, of course, is that our district students, how representative are they of our independent learners? Probably not as much. Our independent learners are probably more white, or higher socioeconomic status, and and probably have fewer English language learners on our English site. But so most of our research and study around our impact on learners from those groups comes from learners who are engaged with our district offerings and where those are, because otherwise we just don't have the data and information for other students.
Super, thank you.
Shani, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, thank you so much for that talk, Kristen. It was very informative. You mentioned kind of data, and in the new classes page, I noticed there was internet safety, and the kind of data is something that we talk a lot on this course, especially since the pandemic, where a lot of schools, particularly under-resourced schools, kind of had to transition, kind of have to grab whatever they could to not disrupt learning. And some of that involves not being fully informed in terms of what they're signing up to do and what students are signing up to do. And a lot of that involves kind of data and demographic data. So I'm wondering, does the internet safety course kind of has that training element for teachers and for schools and parents in terms of how to secure students' data privacy, or is that mainly just for adults?
It is. So the reading level of the course is about 9th grade, maybe 8th grade. So it's meant, it really for students who are at that reading level and above, and any learners. It really is meant, it isn't designed for teachers or for schools to learn that, but you can see here, I just pulled up the course so you can see the units in it. Covers personally identifiable information. So what is personally identifiable information? Thinking about sharing it. User data tracking. So, kind of here, I'll spread out so you can see what cookies, search history, browsing history, geolocation. So all kinds of questions and things about those. How to stay away from cyber attacks and how to not be a victim of cyber attacks. And then we get into some advanced topics, things like what is encryption and decryption and all of that, how security internet protocols and user authentication kinds of methods. So how to make strong passwords, what is multi-factor authentication, yeah. So these are the kinds of topics that are here, which are mostly around helping people be safe on the internet, generally, and where things go. To your question about data, as you can see, it doesn't get into the pieces here are about, you know, your data and protecting your data personally. They don't get into as much if you are a school leader, how can you think about what should you be looking at in protecting your school's data and where those are. But it's an interesting suggestion that school leaders might need a course on that kind of information. We can definitely think about that. And then the other piece we do is be, you know, good citizens as we think about the data agreements that we have with schools, and thinking about, you know, schools as owners of their data and embedding that in our contracts with them so that they continue to own their data. So for example, when we do research, when we have third-party researchers that want to do research on Khan Academy with districts, we actually ask those researchers, we don't directly share the data with those researchers. The schools actually are the ones who decide to pass the data and who actually do the data transfer to third-party researchers, for example, that we want to work with, so that we don't own the data and we're not sharing it in, where we get to. So that's the kinds of overall senses of how we try to train and teach the world about kind of personal security, but also how we try to do the right things on our side when we make agreements.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah.
Carmen?
Hi, thank you again. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the Learnstorm bit of work, because it's really interesting to think about measuring group dynamics and collaborative ways of working, and I don't know if that does that. Is there interest in it? It's an interesting piece of work.
Yeah, so some of my favorite things that we get tagged on social media are these classroom celebrations from Learnstorm, where you see a whole class of, you know, 5th graders having this celebration because they reached a particular milestone on Learnstorm. So it is still individual work. So the students are not collaborating together on solving the problems, but what it is basically each student is working to master skills. So on the system, we have levels of mastery. So you go from attempted to familiar to proficient to mastered as you get more questions about a skill correct. So we call those mastery levels up. And basically you can count those for every student and then add them together for a class. And so we have basically visualizations that then set goals. So if you get the number of mastery levels up equal to the number of students in your class, that's your first ring. You achieve that, and on the site, then it gives fun things. It gives, like, Sal's head bobbing around and saying things, or those kind of things. And then teachers often will tie in-class rewards to reaching some of those things, which is the nice connection of the online to the in-person. So, you're going to get 10 more minutes of free time or whatever it is in the classroom that teachers build on. So it isn't the collaborative in terms of actual collaborative learning, but it is building on the social aspects of motivation in working together to try to build those things. And when we talk to teachers, some teachers will focus on, for instance, getting kids that are pretty far ahead to work with kids that are maybe struggling on something so that they can get the mastery levels up on skills to move them through. We don't do leaderboards. We don't do public individual skill reporting. So the students wouldn't know, hey, Susie's contributed 4 mastery levels up and Kristen hasn't contributed any. We don't want to do that kind of, the research on that kind of reporting suggests it does not lead to good learning outcomes. It's more trying to get everyone working together to build the increases in the numbers of mastery levels up over the whole class over time.
Hey, Victoria, did you have a question?
Yep, thank you so much for your talk. I was interested in what you said about how you've been proactive about reaching the most under-resourced groups and working like directly with schools, and I imagine that's very resource intensive, like in terms of like, you know, putting people on those projects. And that made me think about like, what's the situation of funding for Khan Academy, especially given you're, you know, committed to be nonprofit long term. I guess the most, probably the most recognized nonprofit edtech initiative. What's your situation on funding, and does that constitute a constraint to like what you want to do?
Yeah, so it's a good question. That last piece is important because it does. So we have a budget of about $60 million a year. Sal, when he's fundraising, likes to say we have the budget of a large high school and we're impacting, you know, hundreds of millions of learners. So of that, about 80% comes from philanthropic donations and 20% comes from earned revenue. So for instance, that Math Accelerator is actually sold to schools for a small price per student. We actually find at the district level that charging some amount is actually better than free, because first, districts expect to be paying for supplemental curricula. They have that in their budgets, and that they actually, if they pay a little bit, they have some skin in the game, and it actually will push usage and push, as opposed to when it's free, they don't do that as much. So we do get some of that piece of earned revenue from them. We also get some money from College Board for being the official SAT practice partner. So there's things like that that aren't philanthropy, but are where those are. But it is the case that because we have this funding model, if you compare us to, let's say, many of the high-flying startups that are getting all of the VC money, they can grow very quickly and do new things and spin up a new team to do this and hire 20 new people. We know that it is very hard for us to raise more than, say, $40 million in philanthropy and, you know, maybe 20 in earned revenue, and to be able to move. So we can't grow in the way that a lot of the edtech startups kind of do. And so there is that constraint on what we do. We are always prioritizing. We are always having to make trade-offs about which of these things do we think is going to help students, like increase student learning more, help us get to more learners, help them, you know, stay engaged and working on the platform, and help them learn more. Like, those are basically the three things that, hey, this might be nice to do, but is it going to help us get more learners or help them learn more? Well, then it's going to go to the, you know, lower on the priority list if it's not. So there is a constraint there from doing it. That said, because we are known, we're, you know, a known brand. Our philanthropy, our team is amazing, and just I had not had a lot of exposure to it, but just bringing in $40 million of philanthropy money a year is, you know, a huge lift that they take on and are successful with every year and work towards. So it lets us be free. It provides a lot of that brand halo I was talking about, but it also constrains us in some ways in terms of what we can do differently.
Kristen, I think we're at the time. We want to let you go do the rest of your day. I know it's early for you. So thanks again for getting up early and making the time to chat to us. Really appreciate it. Super interesting talk. And I'm sure we'll all, I mean, I'm going to be getting back on Khan Academy. I was trying to do matrix multiplication a couple weeks ago. So find out how that goes. Yeah, I need some more nudges
I'm
in the
happy to
master learn.
connect with folks on LinkedIn, or, you know, I'm Kristen at khanacademy.org. If you want to follow up with anything, happy to chat.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Kristen. That was great. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.